I'm Miss Elizabeth, and this is part 3 of My Teacher is an Alien. We've got no choice, Peter said. We have to break into Broxham's house to look for evidence. And what did I say? Now that I had someone who was willing to help and had actually given me some good advice, did I say, "Thank you very much"? Are you kidding? I looked at him and said, "You've got to be out of your mind." "I am not," Peter said indignantly. "If we're going to do anything about Broxham, we have to have proof. And the only way to get proof is to get into his house and find some." I thought about that. I couldn't come up with any way around it. How else could we find proof that we were telling the truth? Well, then I thought of something else. "I don't think it'll do any good," I said. "There's nothing much in there. He doesn't have any furniture or anything." "How do you know that?" "I told you I was in there yesterday." "Oh, yeah," Peter said. I forgot. I could tell he still thought I was making this up. "Did you see the whole place?" he asked. I shook my head. "Well, maybe there's something in his bedroom," he said, "or the attic, or the kitchen." His face lit up. "That's it," he said, "the kitchen. Who knows what they eat on the planet he comes from? I bet there'll be all kinds of gross alien slime in his refrigerator." "Peter, you're brilliant," I said. I was actually starting to feel hopeful. All we needed was just one thing that would prove I wasn't making all of this up. "Now, when can we do it?" I asked. "We can't let him catch us." Peter thought for a minute. There's a PTA meeting tomorrow night," he said. "I heard Dr. Bleekman say that all the teachers have to be there. That's the only time we can be sure Broxham will be out of the house." "Tomorrow it is," I said. That was Wednesday. By the time Thursday afternoon rolled around, I was a wreck. I had spent 2 full days sitting in that classroom, staring at Mr. Smith and knowing his handsome face was only a mask that hid the terrifying face of an alien. While none of the other kids were crazy about Mr. Smith, they didn't think there was anything really wrong with him. Only Peter knew the secret, and he thought it was a game I'd invented. "What about Dr. Bleekman?" he asked me during afternoon recess. "What about him?" I asked. "Do you think he's in cahoots with Broxham? They seem pretty chummy." I shook my head. "My mother told me Dr. Bleekman was really angry with Miss Schwartz for quitting so suddenly. He wouldn't have been upset if he'd been wanting to put Broxham in her place." Peter looked at me in astonishment. "Don't you know a cover story when you hear one?" he asked. Of course he acted like he was upset. If he hadn't, it would have been suspicious. The way I figure it, Broxham asked Dr. Bleekman which teacher he wanted to get rid of the most, and then he zapped Miss Schwartz so there would be a spot for him to fill. I felt like there were ants crawling all over my skin. Peter was just playing a game, but what he said made sense. Too much sense. I still couldn't believe that Miss Schwartz had just quit without saying anything to us. Something must have happened to her. My head was whirling. Dr. Bleekman really in on this whole thing? Had Broxham really fried Miss Schwartz? If so, what would happen if he caught Peter and me in his house? If Broxham found some way to get himself excused and came home early to catch us rummaging through his house, would he zap us too? That last question really terrified me. But if the ideas Peter was spinning out were true, it was more important than ever that we unmask Broxham. "How are you going to get out tonight?" I asked Peter. "What do you mean?" he asked. "What do you mean? What do I mean? How are you going to get out of your house tonight?" I had no problem myself. My parents were officers in the PTA, and they always went to meetings. And they had decided at the beginning of the year that I was too old for a babysitter. So as long as I was back before they got home, it wouldn't make any difference. I really didn't like sneaking out on them, but This was a matter of life and death. Peter looked at me in surprise. Are you really planning on breaking into Mr. Smith's house? He asked. His name isn't Smith, I said. It's Broxham. And yes, I'm really planning to search his house. I couldn't bring myself to call it a break-in. I have to have some way to prove what he really is. Peter looked troubled. He rubbed his hands over his skinny face, and then he looked me straight in the eyes and said, This isn't a game, is it? I shook my head. Peter's eyes got wide. He swallowed a couple of times, and then he took a deep breath and said, Don't worry, I'll be there. I could have hugged him. That night I met Peter at 8 o'clock on the corner of Pine and Main. He was carrying a flashlight, which made me feel pretty stupid since I had forgotten mine. It was nearly dark. The crickets were singing and the moon was already risen. Even though it was May, it was cold. Or maybe I was just cold because I was scared. Ready? I asked. Peter nodded. Ready, he said. We each took a deep breath and we set off for the alien's house. I was afraid you might not come, I said after we'd gone a few blocks. Peter shrugged. I didn't want you doing this alone, he said. For a while I was afraid you were trying to pull a joke on me. I thought when I got to the corner you and some of the others might jump out and start laughing at me. Hey, I said, I wouldn't do something like that. I didn't think so, said Peter. That was one of the reasons I came. The other reason was I figured if you really were going to break into Mr. Smith's house, this must be for real. You're not the kind of kid who would do something like that unless it was serious. Believe me, I said, this is serious. No, I believe you, he said nervously. We didn't say anything else until we got to Broxham's house. Well, said Peter, here we are. Here we are, I echoed. But neither of us moved. We just stood there looking at the dark, empty house. I didn't know about Peter, but I was trying to talk myself into taking the next step. To tell the truth, I was so scared I thought I might wet my pants. I don't know how long we stood there, trying to build up enough courage to go in. I do remember looking up at the sky. It was dark as black velvet, and the stars were like diamonds scattered across it. Which one of them did you come from, Broxham, I thought. And why did you have to come here? I heard Peter sigh beside me. Isn't it wonderful, he said, swinging his arms up and out to indicate the entire sky. Don't you want to go there? You've been reading too much science fiction, I said. Come on, let's get this over with. Sharp leaves scraped against our faces as we pushed our way through the hole in the hedge. On the other side, we dropped to our hands and knees and crawled across the lawn. Even though we were pretty sure Broxham wasn't home, we didn't want anyone else to see us and interrupt our mission. The lawn was drenched with dew. By the time we reached the porch, the knees of my pants were soaked through and I was freezing. How are we going to get in? Whispered Peter. Good question. It may sound stupid, but I had been so worried about what we were doing that I hadn't worried about how we were going to do it. I don't know, I hissed back. How do people usually break into a place? Peter looked at me in disgust. How would I know? I'm not a burglar. Well, neither am I snapped. I closed my eyes. Fighting wasn't going to get us anywhere. Let's circle the house, I said. Maybe we'll find an open window or something. We crept along the side of the house as Peter played his flashlight over the windows. I felt thankful for the hedge that masked us from the street. Nothing on this side, he whispered. Check down low, I said. Maybe one of the cellar windows is open. But they were all sealed shut. Peter gestured towards the back of the house. Just around the back corner, we found one of those slanting cellar doors. It was padlocked shut, but the wood was half rotted. and when Peter shook the lock, the whole thing came loose in his hand. He set it aside and carefully lifted the door. It creaked for an eternity as it came open. I found myself staring down into a well of perfect blackness. "Dark," I whispered. "Sure is," said Peter. Then he took a step forward. I followed him, wondering if Broxham had booby-trapped the place. And then I wondered what kind of booby traps an alien would use. Lasers that would cut us off at the knees? Stun guns? Freeze rays? Hey, these guys had come from another star system. Who knew what they could do? We walked down 8 concrete steps. At the bottom, we came to a wooden door, so old it had a latch instead of a knob. Peter lifted the latch and pushed. Nothing. He put his shoulder against the door and shoved again. It swung open with an eerie creak. "After you, madam," he whispered. "Well, at least shine your flashlight in there," I hissed. He pointed the beam through the door. I couldn't see anything special, just a dusty cellar, the kind you'd expect in an old house. "Let's go together," I whispered. Peter took pity on me, and we stepped through the door side by side. "I don't think we're going to find anything down here," he said, shining his light around the cellar. I agreed. Except for the furnace, the stairs up to the first floor, and the cobwebs, and the space was completely empty. Without speaking, he headed for the stairway. I ran into a cobweb and shivered when the wispy, clinging threads brushed over my forehead. "You don't suppose Broxham has any friends here, do you?" Peter asked when we were about halfway up the stairs. I stopped. "I don't think so," I said after a minute. He didn't mention any when he was talking to the guy in the spaceship. Peter nodded. But he'd managed to make me even more nervous than I had been to begin with. What if there was another alien here? What would he do if he caught us snooping around? "Where to?" I asked Peter when we reached the top of the stairs. "Let's try the kitchen," I said, remembering his idea about alien food. When we opened the refrigerator, all we saw were a bunch of cold cuts, a half-empty carton of milk, a bottle of ketchup, and 2 6-packs of beer. "He sure doesn't eat like an alien," said Peter. "Are you sure this guy's from another planet?" "Let's go upstairs," I said. "I'll show you the thing I saw him talking into." Peter closed the refrigerator door, but before he would leave the room, he insisted on checking the cupboards. He even opened the peanut butter jar to see if it really had peanut butter in it and not some kind of extraterrestrial goo. The second floor had 3 rooms. I had high hopes for the bathroom. I thought we might find some kind of weird shampoo there or something. But it was as disappointing as the kitchen. Even the medicine cabinet was filled with typical brand name items. "Do you think Mr. Smith really uses Excedrin?" asked Peter. "Or is this just here to convince people he's a teacher?" "If he was stocking his house to fool snoopers, he'd have put in some furniture," I said. The only place where we found anything even remotely alien was the room where I had seen Broxham talking to the man on the ship. The 2 speakers that looked like pieces of flat plastic were still hanging on the wall. I looked under the dressing table and found the switch Broxham had used to tune in his ship. I reached out to touch it and then pulled my hand back. What if I somehow turned it on and the man from the ship saw Peter and me standing there? "Come on," Peter said. "We might as well go." "You don't believe me anymore, do you?" I asked sadly. Peter shrugged. "Well, this place is weird, but what with no furniture and everything, but there's nothing that would make you think Mr. Smith is an alien." "I believe that you believe what you told me, but whether it's true or not..." He shrugged and left the room. "Wait," I said, following him to the hall. "We still didn't try that door." Peter swung his flashlight in the direction I was pointing. "It's just an attic," he said. I knew that. I could tell by how narrow the door was, but that wasn't the point. So what if it's an attic? I said. Maybe Broxham has something packed away up there. Come on, Peter, we've gone this far. We can't give up now. Oh, all right, said Peter. He opened the door and started up the stairway. When he got about halfway up the stairs, his head passed the level of the attic floor. I was walking so close that I bumped into him when he stopped. What is it? I whispered. When he didn't answer me, I pushed my way up beside him and cried out in horror. For a long time, neither of us said a word. Is she alive? I asked at last. Peter didn't answer me. Peter, I hissed, pinching his arm. Do you think she's alive? Peter turned to me. I could see his face in the blue glow that came from the thing in the center of the attic. His eyes were glazed and blank. I wasn't sure whether he even knew I was there. Peter, I hissed. He shook his head. You weren't kidding, were you? Of course I wasn't kidding. But do you know what this means? Yeah, it means we're in big trouble. Now let's get up there and see if we can figure out what's going on. An alien, Peter said, his voice filled with awe. Mr. Smith is an alien. We're not alone. What are you talking about? I hissed. Intelligent aliens. Mankind is not alone in the universe. Well, I'm feeling pretty alone right now, I said. Are you going to help me or not? Peter closed his eyes and rubbed his face. Suddenly his awe turned to fear. Oh my God, he said. What if Mr. Smith catches us up here? I rolled my eyes. Why do you think I've been so scared all night, you yo-yo? Suddenly I realized what was going on. You never did believe me, did you? I said angrily. You thought this was all just a joke. Peter shook his head. I believed you, he said, but I didn't understand what it meant until I believed it this way. I can't explain, he said. It didn't make any difference. I understood. He was feeling the way I felt when I saw Broxham take his face off. Come on, I said, let's go up there. Despite my brave words, I climbed the rest of those stairs pretty slowly. Peter climbed up beside me. Standing side by side, we stared at the terrible thing we had found. In the center of the attic was a column of blue light. It was about 3 feet across and stretched from the floor to the peak of the ceiling. And in the center of it stood Ms. Schwartz. Her eyes were wide open. They hadn't blinked once in all the time we'd been looking at her. Her frizzy black hair was standing straight out from her head as if she were getting some kind of a horrible shock. Her hands were at her side, her palms forward, fingers separated. I looked carefully, but I couldn't tell if she was breathing. Is she alive? I asked again. I don't know, said Peter. It's hard to tell. We stepped forward. Miss Schwartz didn't move. The air smelled funny. My hair started to move by itself, and I could feel this strange tingling on my scalp. It's a force field, said Peter, taking another step forward. I knew he was the right person to bring with me. Only a person who read that much science fiction would know what to call something like this. Now, if only he knew what to do about it. Unfortunately, he didn't. If I could figure out where it came from, maybe I could turn it off, he told me. But I don't see any equipment. Besides, I'd be afraid of hurting Miss Schwartz. Do you think she's okay in there? I asked. How had Broxham done this to her? Maybe that handsome creep had tricked her into going out on a date with him. What a treat, a date with an alien. I could just imagine his line. Let's go see a film. I'll take you back to my house and lock you in a force field. What a rat. Oh, Miss Schwartz, I mean, what are we going to do? I couldn't stand seeing her trapped like that. I stepped forward and tried to reach out to touch her. Don't! Peter cried when he saw what I was doing, but it was too late. I had already laid my hands against the blue force field. I felt a tingle run through my body. For a terrible instant, I thought I was going to be drawn into the force field too. But it didn't happen. What did happen was I heard a voice inside my head. Susan, don't worry about me. You've got to warn the others. It was Miss Schwartz. Peter, I yelled, come here, touch the force field. You can hear Miss Schwartz. I suppose it sounded crazy, but by this time he was ready to believe anything. He pushed through the heavy air that surrounded the force field and put his hand next to mine on the column of light. Hello, Peter, said Mrs. Schwartz. Telepathy, whispered Peter in awe. These guys are amazing. Yes, they are, said Mrs. Schwartz inside our heads. Amazing and dangerous. What do they want? I asked. You, she said. I yelled and jumped back from the force field. The air around me felt so thick it was hard to move. I realized I lost my connection with Miss Schwartz. Pushing forward, I pressed my hand back against the force field. I'm sorry, said Miss Schwartz. I didn't mean to frighten you. I looked at her face. Her eyes were staring straight ahead. It was weird to hear her voice inside my head when she was standing there like that, looking as if she'd been frozen. Don't worry about me, she said. Your job right now is to warn the others. Warn them of what? Asked Peter. About Broxholm. His mission here is to find 5 students and take them back with him. He plans to select the best, the worst, and the 3 most average kids. What's he going to do with them? I asked. The voice in my head sounded worried. I don't know for sure. The plan is to bring them back here and head out into space on the night of May 26th. But that's next week, I cried. Miss Schwartz moaned. I didn't know so much time had gone by, she whispered inside our heads. I can't keep track inside here. Listen, you have to unmask him somehow. If you don't, we're all in terrible danger. And just then we heard the front door open and close. Talk about terrible danger. Broxholm was back. And we'll see what he does in the next part 4.